I'm really excited to have Interact here. This is a project that I've gotten to be involved with since 2017, and really at the core of it is the two speakers we have today, Zoe Poirier-Stevens and Jan Kestens. Zoe's the research manager for Interact. Interact is a pan-Canadian collaboration of scientists, city builders, community partners, and residents that are designing healthy cities. And Zoe is really the gels. She might tell you this, but she told us earlier today that this is her 7-year anniversary with the project to this day. And so she is really a lot of the vision and function of the project as it goes forward and is going to bring forward that work. Jan Kestens is with us today. For those in CapaCITY, he's a PI on CapaCITY. He was also the original nominated principal applicant of the Interact project. His research focuses on understanding how urban changes influence health. He's really interested in sustainability. I'll tell you, he's interested in complex systems, and he really likes to develop new tools to collect and analyze spatial data and processes. Maybe some magic about these two people. If you're ever with Zoe in person, I encourage you to eat with her or ask her where to eat. It's a very delightful experience. So that's one of her special skills, not on here. And one thing about Jan I would highlight is if anyone's ever done a personality test that's about these different colors, I've learned, I don't know if Jan's even done this, but Jan is a yellow. He has all of these ideas and creativity that he brings to the research process and makes him an absolute joy to work with on these fronts and added values. Okay, so with those introductions, I'm going to send it over to the two of Zoe and Jan, who I think are in the same room. Okay. So you can unmute yourselves and take it from here.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, we're in the same room, but with one mic, so hopefully the sound is good. So thank you. Done.
Thank you very much, Megan, for this nice introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for joining. I'm actually starting with a declaration of interest because following 2 CIHR grants I received in 2010, I've been involved in 2 spin-off companies that market some of the products that we're going to be showcasing, or at least that have been used in the research we're presenting today. So one of the companies is called Polygon, and we have been using the advanced survey infrastructure, and MobiSense is another company that has developed a sense-doc device we're going to talk about.
Well, thank you. And so thank you for the warm intro, Megan. I wanted to share that Interact works across Turtle Island. I've highlighted our cities here. We're grateful to our hosts for access to these lands. I'm joining from Jokjoke, the unceded land that belong to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. So pleased to be here. I think Dan's going to set the stage for us. What the project is about.
Okay, let's start with that. So we probably share the idea that if we invest in built environment interventions and sustainable transportation, we can transform our cities and we can improve health for everyone. We can improve equity outcomes. So that's sort of where we came from. And also maybe to mention that in 2016, there was a CIHR Environment and Health Signature Initiative that really wanted to fund research teams with relatively major funding to think about environment and health. And so we submitted our proposal, which was Interact. And Interact stands for Interventions, Equity, Research and Action in Cities team. And we'll probably go through some of these important keywords here that we have in our title. But one of the keywords is team, and certainly Interact is a collaborative effort of a lot of motivated people. And I'm not only talking about let's say, academic investigators. So Daniel Fuller, Megan, and me are the co-PIs of this team. We have a series of additional investigators involved, but also we have important institutional partners. We have city partners. We're going to go a little bit more in details about which cities are involved. We have great staff and important people who have been contributing to this effort, as well as quite a number of trainees, but also community members. So it's really a collective village effort. Ça prend un village, on dit en français, also. Yeah. So back to the cities. So our team is organized and is interested in interventions in 4 different cities that are listed here. In Victoria, we're looking at the all ages and abilities cycling network and its impact. In Vancouver, interested in the City Greenways. In Saskatoon, about the focus was on the bus rapid transit. And in Montreal, we have highlighted the Réseau Express Vélo, also a cycling infrastructure. And there is a plus that Zoe has been putting next to that, because we are also interested in other built environment interventions, trying to have maybe a little bit more holistic vision about how the city transforms and changes. So yeah, I've talked about the 4 cities, but you probably know that we've been setting up these cohorts as we track how the city changes in terms of built environments. We also wanted to hear from community members, and so we have these cohorts. More than 3,500 people have joined, and I think that number is counting, because we are currently in our 4th wave of data collection, and we have interesting success in recruitment. Yeah, a lot of local partners, as I was saying. We also have a national knowledge hub, which is a common place for all our partners and stakeholders to come together and share findings, share ideas about how city transforms and how these impact health and equity. So maybe here a little bit about the conceptual underpinnings of our work. And all models are bad, but some are useful. I think that's sort of the saying. And this is a conceptual model that is, of course, very simplified, but it helps us guide also our presentation today. So in green, the green bucket shows our 3 main health outcomes we were interested in. So physical activity, well-being, and social connectedness are sort of our focus health questions. These are linked to built environment interventions. As you understood, it's our focus, how these interventions impact health, but they are also related to mobility, as you see here. And mobility is an important aspect, not only in terms of the interventions we're looking at, mostly looking at cycling interventions or bus rapid transit, but also mobility is a core component, because as people move around, they are exposed to different types of interventions or environments, and this is something we've been integrating quite a bit in our framework. This is also linked to how the city is imagined or planned. So this is a yellow bucket about urban planning. So the context of the built environment interventions. And of course, at the bottom, you will see this aspect of inequities, which is much simplified here on gender, income, and racial inequities. But more profoundly, in the last round of funding, we've tried to improve our consideration of equity, and not only looking at health equity from an individual or population group perspective, but also looking at distributional equity. So where these interventions take place, what areas or what neighborhoods are targeted, and from a procedural equity perspective, how this comes to be and who decides what types of frameworks are guiding the planning of the city. So that's sort of the conceptual model. And we're going to go through these different buckets, starting with the urban planning, if I can say. And at the very beginning of our adventure, somewhere in 2017, I think, we thought would be important to understand how stakeholders considered success in terms of implementation of built environment factors. And so I'm going to start with that and talk to you a little bit about what we did here. So we actually conducted concept mapping exercises in these 4 cities, asking various stakeholders, so mostly people from the city, but also other organizations who had been involved in the interventions of interest, about what they considered the success factors. Concept mapping is a structured mixed method that basically combines the brainstorming phase with a count sorting exercise. And then on top of that, you have some cluster analysis and dimensionality reduction algorithms that make it possible to visualize how a group of people understand an issue. And this is a concept map of the success factors that came up in Victoria as an example. So each of these points that are numbered is an idea, is a success factor that were voiced by our participants. And then you see the clusters that came out of it. Here we have 5 main clusters. For example, political leadership and support is the blue one in the center and was considered pretty important. I'm going to go back to that. So we did that in the 4 cities, and I won't go into all these details, but you can see here the concept maps for the different cities, and sometimes themes that came out were common. For example, in terms of stakeholder engagement, it was something that was pretty common in all the cities, but sometimes visions were also a little bit different. So, for example, in Montreal, where maybe the specificity of the intervention was less, the intervention was less specific, we had sort of more of a higher level vision around what are the common vision for the future, how stakeholders collaborate with citizens, for example. And of course, we'll provide all the list of papers that linked to these slides, so you can look at the details later on if you want. So these concept maps also come with what we call go zone graphs that really just show how these items were rated in terms of importance and feasibility. So for example, the green here area identified 3 items that are considered both important and feasible, sort of low-hanging fruits for future planning, but also interestingly looking at those that are considered important but less feasible. So for example, items 21 and 23. And here you can start to think about what can be done to push these items into the more feasible zone, or what are the barriers for these items that are, however, important. Yeah, and of course, that was the perspective from the stakeholders, but you can also ask community members, for example, what they wanted. So here we sort of duplicated the exercise in Montreal, and we did the concept mapping with the stakeholders about the success factors of implementation that we just saw here. But more interestingly, also, we looked at what community members wanted in terms of intervention. So here again, using concept mapping, we have these 6 clusters looking at what they wanted to improve quality of life. And interestingly, we could create a matrix that would combine both stakeholders' perspectives on factors that contribute to successful interventions and interventions that were wanted by community members. And each of these cells was then used in a workshop with various people from the city, for example, to think about, what do we have in place in terms of intervention or plan or policies, and what are the gaps, what is lacking. So these concept mapping exercises help constitute a common vision, but also plan for future steps. So that was one of the work we did at the very beginning, actually.
Yeah,
so
that's right. The first research activity.
Yeah.
In terms of the urban planning bucket, or in that section, we were also interested in looking at how health and equity are considered in policy and in practice. So one of the things we're interested in understanding the impacts of our 4 interventions, but maybe a first step is to understand what was the policy, what is guiding that implementation of these 4 interventions. And policy context is important because it'll guide prioritization. So it'll define the kind of choice of the type of project. Are we building a AAA network versus sharrows and things like that? It also defines target areas for investment. So are there certain neighborhoods that were tapped for investment over others? And finally, it also defines who's involved in decision making and how that process happens. So the policy context is really important. And we were interested in seeing how health and equity came up. So we looked at transportation plans in our 4 cities. And we also talked to planners. We wanted to see specifically in the case of our 4 interventions, how those two concepts came up. So we talked to a range of key informants, people that worked in planning, some people that were in advocacy. We also spoke to municipal councillors who had an interesting perspective as well, and some people that worked in comms and engagement. And I'm just reporting really high-level results here. This paper is forthcoming. I think it's very close to publication. So broadly here, the health was considered very like at a really high level. So it was often part of a policy's vision. It was part of the high-level goals. And then it also came up more specifically in terms of safety and modal shift, and specifically around targets. So one of the things we were interested in looking at is, did policies have specific targets or indicators to try to track how urban change was impacting health? And the two that we found were around safety, so Vision Zero goals, reducing road fatalities, and modal shift. So planners were also very interested in moving from people towards active modes with the idea of this physical activity increase. So that's very succinctly what we found, but there's more specific kind of like city level stories that we found as well. In terms of equity, that came up a bit less in policies. Yeah, so only 4 of the policies had like specific actions targeting populations, but planners, on the other hand, had a lot to say. So planners that we spoke to put a lot of attention to equity. They were considering who was involved in decision-making and who they were informing throughout their process. One thing that was interesting in the policies that we saw a lot of language around like universal accessibility, all ages and abilities, all incomes, but the specificity was often missing. So rarely were groups named, and that can be an issue when coming up with indicators or targets, because it's such a broad goal that it's hard to kind of track progress. Mm-hmm. So maybe some broad conclusions from this work is that safety and accessibility are key for achieving health and equity. That often came through from the planners. We also heard that equity policy is a fast-moving area. So a lot of the cities that we spoke to had equity frameworks that they were adopting, and the connection from that city-level equity framework to actual transportation planning hadn't been done yet, or was in the course of happening. And then I think specifically we heard from city staff that there was some questions around balancing needs from different groups. So for example, I think one of the examples was in Vancouver and the Greenways, where a lot of people wanted to keep the greenway surface graveled, but they opted for asphalt to make it more accessible for a range of users. So as we did this work, we also heard a lot of questions from our city partners about like kind of this space between equity frameworks where cities were committing to equity goals, but then that not really landing in terms of their operational work. And so we prepared this report. This is a year-long process. We worked with cities across 3 cities in Canada to surface some promising practices around how to move from rhetoric to reality in terms of transport equity. That report that we call PEACED, that you might have heard of, this is the acronym, PEACED, is available online, and it might be helpful to people here on the call. I also want to say maybe PEACED is in French means like a way, a path, or it's also kind of like a clue. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we think about it. It's kind of a path towards thinking about this topic, really. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next big section of our presentation. We're going to look at this purple section, so built environment interventions. Also, we're calling this urban change. And we're going to present 3 pieces here. I'll cover the first now. And here we were interested in looking at how interventions pattern socio-spatially, and where interventions happen and which populations benefit from those. And so we looked at cycling interventions in 3 cities. We didn't do this for Saskatoon because Saskatoon's main intervention is public transit, and so we it's less of their focus. So we just focus on those 3 cities. So I'll show the results for Montreal here because there's a lot, but I want to share the maps here. So a postdoc on our team, Hiroshi Mamiya, led this work. He mapped the cycling infrastructure and network in Montreal over 10 years. And so we can see that there's been a significant increase through the years. The network has increased from by 62% in the city. And we were also interested in looking at kind of the populations that were living in these areas that benefited from expansion. And so overall, the distance to cycling infrastructure for these priority populations has reduced throughout over the years. So we all see the slope going down. And in some cases, we're also seeing that the gap between so this is 2011 here, and so the gap. I'm sorry, I don't think you see my cursor. Maybe.
Yes, we see.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, good. The gap in 2011 was much wider. So this top line here is the areas with a high proportion of racialized populations, whereas the black line here is lower. And so the gap lowers in 2020. So this work is also in progress, but some of the things we can say from this analysis is that only expansion is insufficient to correct spatial inequities. And sorry, another thing we found was that there was areas with families and children, they remain underserved by cycling infrastructure. And that is an issue as we move towards trying to make cycling more accessible for a range of users. So Jan, do you want to take over for here?
Yeah, sure. So another topic of interest, and maybe that's also one lesson from Interact, is that as we start building this infrastructure and this research program, all these new topics or additional topics come into play. And so we've had the chance to also get an ancillary grant on gentrification, because of course, an important aspect of built environment intervention is to think about who benefits, and as people move, you may target certain areas, and then the social composition of this area may change, and there are people you originally targeted don't benefit as much as one thought. So gentrification is this important process where formerly deprived neighborhoods that have been underfunded see an influx of higher SES populations. And so when we think about built environment interventions, it quickly and often raises the question of gentrification. That's why there are also talks about green gentrification, for example, that the fact of greening might lead to gentrification. There have been studies around cycling and gentrification too. So that's one of the things we've really also delved into. And we've developed this tool, which is called Genuine, and that's a fantastic acronym, but I can't remember what it stands for. But it's something around gentrification and equity. Maybe I'll have to look it up. I could put the question in the chat. So basically, we've mapped and we've computed gentrification indicators across the country, across Canada, for all the CMAs. And we've done that using 4 major indicators, different ways of measuring gentrification. And we've done that across 4 measures. It's all available online. It's also available on Canoe. All these data sets are available on Canoe. And we have computed gentrification. So it's really a temporal process. It's really between census periods that you can compute areas that have seen this influx of higher SES people. And you can then categorize areas as both being candidate for gentrification. So if you're in a deprived area, you have a potential of being gentrified. And then you can see if or not your census tract has been gentrified. So that's what we've done. The paper is also available online. And I think in Canoe, we only have a few years of census, but we've meanwhile increased it from 2001 to 2021. So it's an important work that we've been doing and that we've then linked to other outcomes. So for example, one of the work we've done is look at changes in greenness. So we know that cities are investing or trying to improve greenness and tree canopy, both to address issues of climate change, but also heat islands, for example. And we also know that often greenness is patterned socially. So here is some work we've done in Montreal, looking at changes in green space. So anything that has an NDVI above 0.3, or tree canopy, where we mix the NDVI measure with tree height, vegetation height. It was available through LIDAR data in Montreal. And you see on these maps that we've looked at changes between 2011 and 2017. Most of the areas have seen an improvement, so in more green space and more tree canopy. Some areas have seen a reduction. And then we've looked at these outcomes in relation to various determinants, material deprivation, racialized populations, and gentrification. So you see here, for example, a map that simply depicts material deprivation on the x-axis and changes in green space on the y-axis. So for example, the bottom line of colors would be areas where there has been the less improvement in greenness. And as you see on the map, it's pretty strongly spatially patterned. There are important spatial patterns that emerge. This work showed that in terms of results, maybe you want to go to the next slide. And I don't want to go into the details of the models, but mainly what we show is that there are increases in inequity in terms of green space and tree canopy in Montreal during that period. And also that there was an interaction with greenness at baseline. So areas with higher green space or tree canopy values at baseline showed even stronger increases in green space and tree canopy, which also explains the growing gradient. Finally, there was also a relation with gentrification and census tracts that were ineligible for gentrification. So basically high-income census tracts, so also greater increases in urban vegetation. So whereas there are increases in vegetation overall, inequities are also increasing, unfortunately. So that was some of the work we've shown here. I think we're going to the next bucket. Yeah, that's the plan.
It's our third section now.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these health outcomes, this green bucket. And more specifically, we're going to tell you a little bit how we're measuring these dimensions. So changes in physical activity, social connectedness, and well-being. Yeah. So this is sort of shows our data collection timeline, and it's a sort of a simplified version because we have a more one that has more content, but it's simplified. So here we see the different waves of data collection, wave 1 to wave 6 that are planned until 2028. It's our quantitative data collection with our cohorts, and we also have a few data collection points with more qualitative data collection, mostly with about perception of change among our participants, but we also have some qualitative data collection with key informants that are also in there. And as we constitute these cohorts and collect data among our participants, we also look at built environment change through this period, and then of course gives us the possibility to look at how these built environment changes relate to health outcomes changes. So how does a participant become Interact participants. So basically, every 2 years, we have these data collection periods. It's mostly online questionnaires. So people sign up. We have different recruitment methods that we try to vary as much as we can so as to also target and recruit a diversity of participants. So basically, the basis is that people sign up for an online survey on health and mobility. They can then also complete a map-based questionnaire that tells us more about their activity locations as well as their social networks. And they can also sign up for a mobile app where we collect data on well-being, intraday variations in well-being using ecological momentary assessment. This mobile app also captures GPS data, so we have information about their daily mobility, as well as accelerometry to measure physical activity. Some of the participants also signed up to wear a wearable sensor. So it's a SenseDoc device that has continuous measurement of GPS and accelerometry. So that altogether, these tools provide us quite interesting and complete data about people's health, behavior, but also perception of neighborhood change and well-being and social connectedness. Just to give you a few numbers, I don't want to overwhelm us with numbers here, but to illustrate, so for example, Health Wave 1, we had 1,100 participants in Montreal and around 300 in the other cities. And you see the numbers for the different waves. Wave 2, for example, we had a decrease in Montreal. Some of these decreases are also linked to the COVID-19 epidemic where we had lower numbers of participants. So it gives you an idea of the participants. So for example, the SenseDoc, people who are SenseDoc devices, we have much smaller samples. However, these remain relatively large samples for cohorts that have continuous GPS and accelerometry data. So all together, we have pretty good numbers. And of course, also repeated measures. So some people have been participating to several waves, and we're currently in our 4th wave of data collection.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we'll be updating these tables soon. We wanted to share an example of some of the work that we've been able to do with this data. So, Jan said this is a longitudinal study. I think a lot of our energy has been placed into recruiting participants, and we'll be soon turning to actually working with these multiple waves of data. But in the meantime, we've worked on a lot of cross-sectional analysis, and I wanted to share this one here, which is physical activity. So we wanted to look at where people were doing physical activity, what kind of environments they were in. Are these walkable? Are these transit intense? Are they green? Are they gentrifying neighborhoods? So we used SenseDoc data and calculated quintiles of physical activity. So the purple is the most active, and orange here you'll find is the less active. And I wanted to show these two, the cities this way, because there's some really different patterns. So here in Montreal, we're seeing a lot of, and Saskatoon, we're seeing a lot of activity in central areas. And it's kind of outside the city where we're seeing more of the orange. And versus Victoria and Vancouver, it's a bit of different patterns. So we're seeing a lot of people being active outside of this main area. Victoria maybe is a bit more of a patchwork. Yeah. So we were interested in looking at the kind of, what are these environments like? And so we found that they're close to home. So a lot of people do physical activity really close to home. So that residential environment has a lot of impact on the kind of activity you're doing. So we found that 45% of time spent being physically active happened in the home dissemination area. These areas where people are very active are also walkable. So the high walkability was associated with more physical activity. And so I don't know if people are familiar with CanAle, but it's a walkability score. And so for each quintile increase in more walkability, the active minutes per dissemination area increased by 15 to 35%, depending on the cities. So that's important increase. When we look at where people were doing less physical activity, well, they happened in areas that were highly compact and close to transit. So the urban compactness was associated with less physical activity across all 4 cities. And in 3 of the cities, so not Saskatoon, but in Montreal, Vancouver, Victoria, proximity to public transit was negatively associated. So people near buses, near trams aren't doing that physical activity as much. So overall, we found that home location really matters, that multi-city comparative studies are really important. It's important to also see what aspects are city specific in terms of physical activity promotion. And we also found that local context is central to the design of physical activity interventions. So, for example, implementing multi-use paths near transit centers in cities like Montreal, Vancouver, Victoria may increase physical activity and public transit use, whereas that kind of intervention might not be as needed in Saskatoon, where there was more physical activity around public transit. All right, so I think we're about 40 minutes in, so right on track. And we wanted to take a bit of time to revisit where we are today. So Interact has been around for 8 years. I've been with the team for 7. Thanks, Megan, for mentioning it. And we've grown a lot. We've struggled also. And so we have this little timeline. I think we're going to just comment on a few of the milestones and hurdles we've gone through, and then we'll close on some questions that we're looking for the future. Then you want to start?
Yeah. So I mean, these items are not chronologically ordered here. It's more things we thought about. So interdisciplinary team, I think that's a core and important aspect of our work. I think the interdisciplinarity is really key to maybe to get a because of the diversity of the topics also we are addressing, but also the diversity of methods that we are trying to leverage by doing this work. So I think we've been relatively successful in bringing together a team with quite different perspectives and having conversations and engaging these perspectives. So I think that's a key element. And that's both probably needs to be continually thought about. Do we need additional new ways of thinking? Are we starting to be in an echo chamber maybe? So that's important.
Yeah, I think that's also led us to we have a number of peer-reviewed publications, which is a nice win for us, and a lot of publications through different disciplines. One thing I'm jumping ahead here, but one of the things that is missing from this presentation that Jan was maybe disappointed to not have front and center was all the methodological advancements we've worked on. So we have a team that works on working with all this big data and making sense of these, turning them into more meaningful information. And a lot of the energy on the team has gone there.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way. So a lot of these objectives also are based on the longitudinal understanding, and so as long as we don't have these different data points, it's difficult to get these publications out. So I think it's a nice way to get the ball rolling, to have these methodological advances, while, if I can say in a certain way, waiting for these multiple data points.
Yeah. One thing that in my role I've been very focused on is retaining and recruiting our cohort. So we put, the staff puts a ton of energy, and the entire team, the PI team puts a ton of energy into data collection every 2 years. It takes many months to prepare that, and then it runs for many months, and then we're still processing data. So it's almost 1 year out of 2 where we're really, a lot of the brains on the team are focused on data collection with the cohort. And,
and maybe I'm a little naive on that, but I always had the sort of the dream of having maybe more institutions being involved in setting up a cohort that can answer this type of questions and not just having a research team drive that. And maybe the multiplicity of cohorts here and there are also something we have to think about as researchers. And yeah. But I think also our broader perspective gave us a lot of possibilities to submit other grants and develop complementary work. I think that was an interesting aspect. The example of gentrification was only one example of other grants we could leverage.
Maybe I'll also say, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed in this project is sharing those early results locally, and sharing those with our city partners, checking in with them, and then it's led to some new ideas. Piece to project, the transportation equity work that we did was led by our city partner, or came out of our city partners' needs, and so that's been very rewarding as well. And then maybe we can finish on growing team and collaborations, which is the capacity.
Well, CapaCITY is I think it's a much broader enterprise with even a larger team, but certainly I think part of how our thinking evolved as we went through the years also brought us to think about the capacity possibility. So yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll move to our last slide so we can have about 15 minutes of questions and discussion, which we really welcome. Some of the things we're thinking about as we move into the next 7 years or 8 years of Interact or more are the opportunity of these large population cohorts. We've talked about them, and kind of this challenge of translating evidence into tools for decision making, really putting that data into the hands of the people that need it most, and how that can inform their decision making. There's also this idea around recruiting participants that represent structurally marginalized communities, which has been a real challenge on our team, and I'm sure in other teams as well. And so some of the work we're doing now is really thinking through these approaches on better engaging these groups, and what kind of methods are best suited for reaching these communities. And I guess I'll finish and spread those more. And what's exciting is that Interact has the largest cohort of GPS and accelerometry in the world. So that's a real opportunity here to leverage the kind of big data, but we're still working on that, creating meaningful indicators with our co-investigators. But there's a ton of work to do there, but I think there's some real insights that will be available to us through that work. So maybe we end here. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Open the microphones for questions and comments.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. If anyone saw my expression during a few of those, it was a blast from the past for me as well. So that was a delight to have there. To the organizers, including myself. So I thought we had an open Q&A, but I think it's just the chat, is it? So at this point, I would welcome the audience to either put up your hand if you want to speak directly, or to put a question in the chat. And we'll see them there and can respond to them. You know, part of the reason that we sought out Zoe and Jan to do this presentation today is that, as some of you might know, Interact was a team grant that then led into project grants, but it was one of the precursors to the capacity team. So many people on capacity will say something, or like pull in things that we're like, oh, that's what we did in Interact, or like, this is something that we struggled with and learned, and so let's take that approach. But we were aware that not everybody in Interact, or not everybody was as familiar with Interact, and so it was a great opportunity to have this group speak. I will highlight also that there's another team grant that was funded in the same competition, Chase, the active school travel team, that also sort of went through that team grant as well, and many of those people are in capacity as well. Having been in both of those, we learned many things, different things and similar things across them as well. So, thanks for sharing. I learn things from these two in this project every day. I can start us off with some questions, but I do encourage people to put their questions in the chat. I'm a bit close to this project, so now I have to figure out which is the right question for me to ask that I thought was useful.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe my question goes to Zoe. Can you talk a bit? Something that Capacity is also trying to do is like a lot of training and supporting students in this, and that's actually a huge part of your work as well. Um, so I guess I invite you to share anything from this, but a bit of like it's okay to share things like what works and what doesn't, or like how to get why students are excited and engaged in this and which aspects of it you think works well. We've had tons of ideas over the years. So is there anything you
Mhm.
want to say about graduate students and
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're really at the core of this work. Like they're the ones really driving analysis and like asking questions. And I think, yeah, so that indeed that aspect is super important. When I first started, there was a nice structure. We had a training program, we had guidelines, and I think that really is helpful. Like having a strong structure, like just on the operational side, like having very clear uh, um, our code, a structure in which students can find themselves, have access to what are our open research questions, seeing where they could explore more. Also think leaving a lot of freedom is important. I think of Julie here, she might be online. She's doing her PhD student and did some interviews with families, which was a bit outside of the main interact core activities, but is providing extremely rich information on social connectedness and families. And so I think that there's it was nice to also have some room for flexibility to new ideas. In terms of engaging them, I think we had in 2019 we did a trainee summit. I think was it called the summit in Saskatoon. That was a ton of fun. We had a lot of students working on I guess on the wave one data, it was just a time where we had a lot of new students join, and it made sense to have this 2-day session where we shared research questions. And it was a way for other trainees to connect with one another. And I think that was also very valuable, also for the entire team, like seeing for the researchers as well, for me, hearing about different interests and how different researchers worked also. I'm used to working with Jan, which is one model of supervisor.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting to hear how others work.
great. Thank you. So now we have about 8 minutes left and the questions are coming in. I don't know if you can see them as well. Can you see them on your screens?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would invite you to just respond to any like quick
Yeah.
answers if you can,
Yeah, I
but
can
any
start
that are
there. So
relevant.
there is
Okay.
a question from Becca about selecting data only from adult groups. What about kids' schools? Yeah, so our cohorts are only adults, and so it's a limitation of our work. However, we have also looked at, so we have a PhD student, Julie Carman, who's been looking at walking experiences of parents. So she's been doing go along and qualitative surveys of parents who are part of Interact adults, but who are children. And so she's been looking at their experience, including when sometimes they work with children, but we are not we don't have data on children per se. So that's something we can't really look at. And maybe another question from Ben.
Yeah.
About what does the future of cohort studies look like?
Mhm.
Are there ways in which you think we can improve our ability to recruit and run cohort studies for applications similar to Interact? It's a big question. I get the sense that as we move towards ubiquitous screen in pockets of everyone, maybe there are new ways of doing these type of surveys. I'm working with a group in France where it's a cohort of adolescents, and now they have done these little capsule of questionnaires. So they've segmented the questionnaires into very small bites that people can easily respond, like 5 minutes, 6 minutes, little things. And so that's maybe a way. However, I think the one of the problems is the multiplicity of groups and teams who set up these cohorts, and so the difficulty to recruit, and then there is sort of this competition between the different research groups, which doesn't really make sense. So hopefully we can one day bring together institutions and maybe cities to collectively think about, can we set up a big 10,000 people cohort where people can contribute as they go, and they have these little chunks of data that they can provide, and it's not too time consuming, but it's still useful for the research community as a whole. That's one thing. And then, of course, the tracking of urban change is another important issue that is, I think, making progress with more and more accessible data from cities. But yeah.
I'll just say briefly on that is that it requires a ton of effort and time, and like it almost just the retention of a cohort, I think, requires like staff throughout the entire research project, even though if you're not actively collecting data collection. Keeping in touch with participants is really important. And so it requires quite a bit of investment. It's not just this one time, like, okay, we're in recruitment now, we're not. It's a constant. So I think as we think about if we're putting together cohort studies, I think the planning of having sufficient funding and resources to keep that going is really important.
Mm-hmm. There is a question about seasonality. I don't think we have much about that. Some of the work we've done on ecological momentary assessment, so we have students who have looked at data on well-being and how well-being changes throughout the day. And there were some aspects of seasonality that were included, but mostly in terms of meteorological terms, so temperature and so on. And so there were some aspects of seasonality, but it's pretty specific, the work we've done so far on that.
Yeah, but we do ask frequency of mode use by season. So I think that's something that we would be able to integrate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pete.
There is a question about
there
is a question about gentrification. What are the criteria? So there are different ways of measuring gentrification, and that's our genuine work where we've simply computed these 4 ways of doing it. It's very often relatively similar in terms of computing the changes in populations with higher income in a census tract. So there are these criteria that will define if your census tract is considered gentrified or not. And more broadly, we are currently working on also causal loop diagrams. So we are looking at causal processes associated with gentrification. There is a paper, I mean, there are a few papers on gentrification we've been publishing. One is to look at temporality, what comes first. Is it interventions that lead to gentrification, or is it gentrification that leads to more intervention? So that's one paper we've looked at. And if I am right,
gentrification comes before cycling.
Yeah. So that's a temporality aspect, but we're also looking at causal processes, so trying to have a little bit larger complex system perspective, and what are the causes and consequences of gentrification. So we've done a literature review where we have a paper in preparation on that, and we have done some focus groups to build these causal loop diagrams that we're gonna be using for doing fuzzy cognitive mapping and some modeling, trying to also do some simulations to see if we can provide decision support tools for stakeholders and cities.